All right, everyone, we're going to wrap things up for Unit 8 with motivation and emotion and stress with that final latter piece. This set of video notes is probably going to be deceptively longer in comparison to some of the other video notes that we've put together, simply just because this is one of those components that I think really goes a long way to show you how the content specifically impacts you. And since I know that for many of you this class at times has been very overwhelming and very stressful, that this would be a good chance to kind of give you ways of taking what it is that we're learning and applying it to real world kind of scenarios. So when we first start with discussing anything on stress, we have to differentiate that concept from something called a stressor, because they are two different things. A stressor is any kind of stressful stimulus, a condition that ends up demanding that you adapt to it. So usually it's going to be a thing or a situation, okay? A car accident, too much homework, a friend irritating you, for example. So that's what we're discussing when we say stressor, the condition that ends up evoking the physiological and mental response from you, which is stress. Okay, that is the physical and mental alteration that occurs in response to that stressor. Now, it's important to recognize that we can perceive stressors as challenging or threatening. Challenging stressors oftentimes don't end up having super negative effects on us. And when people perceive a challenge put in place, they have a tendency to have much more positive reactions to that stressor, and it just seems to have a better response from a person in general. But if you perceive a situation to be threatening, on the other hand, that you're presented with stressors you perceive as threatening, that's going to be a little bit of a different situation. They're going to be have a tendency to last much longer in a person's life, and they can end up having very detrimental effects to a person's health, whether that be mental or emotional or physical. So there are four components to a stress response. You have the cognitive appraisal of the stressor. You identify whether the presentation of that is a threat or a challenge, and then you determine how it is that you're going to cope in reaction to that. It's really important to remember that the cognitive appraisal of a stressor is going to be different for every single person. Just as we've discussed that two people can go through an identical situation and come out with different understandings and takeaways from that, it's no different than two people being presented with the same stressor and having two completely different responses to that. While some students perceive AP psychology content to be really, really, really difficult and stressful, others perceive it to be something that they enjoy and find challenging, and it evokes a very different kind of response from them in kind. So that's really important to recognize. The second component to a stressful response is the physiological reaction that your body gives to that. So oftentimes that has a tendency to be heightened heart rate, heightened blood pressure, dilation of pupils. There's that sympathetic nervous system that tends to kick in response to stress. The third piece is subjective feeling. Usually that has the tendency to be the emotion that the person experiences, whether that be overwhelmed, upset, maybe motivated to some extent because the person feels that the stressful piece is challenging to them and they want to prove that they can do it. There's all different kinds of feelings that a person can undergo when they feel stressed. Then you have the behavior itself, the action that you take as a result of the stressor being presented. So stress and stressors, it's important to recognize that stress in and of itself isn't merely just that stimuli being presented and then a response that occurs in kind. It's not just a simplistic kind of cause and effect scenario. It's a process that we have to place a cognitive label on, and then we have to learn to cope with the environment that we are provided with in regards to the stressors that end up coming in front of us. So let's take a look at this visual right here. This is taken from your Myers textbook just to kind of help you better understand how all this works. Let's say I don't know about you, but I've always been somebody that struggled with math very, very, very much. Let's say that the stressor that is presented to you is a very difficult math test. It's something that you know is coming, and that as you've moved through the unit, you've struggled a whole lot on. There are two different ways that the cognitive label can come into play. You can perceive the situation as one that is a threat or one that's a challenge. And as we said earlier, those are two very different takeaways for things. If you perceive it as a threat, this is going to be kind of that emotional and reactionary component of, oh my gosh, this is so, I'm not capable of doing this. I just can't handle it. The challenge piece to this is, I know it. I've just got to apply everything that I know, and that's a challenge that I can handle and I can take on and I can prove it. Within those two appraisals, then you're going to have two different kinds of coping responses. If you feel that this is a threatening situation, you're going to be stressed to the point of distraction. You won't even want to address studying for it. Maybe you just end up developing a piece of learned helplessness and you just don't feel like there's anything you can do for it, so you just give up. Or with the challenging piece, you have kind of a physiological arousal to the point of being able to stay really focused and determined, and then ending up successful on that math test. So as I said earlier, within looking at this piece of stress and stressors, when stress is short-lived or taken as a challenge, the stressors that are presented to us can have a tendency to have positive effects. There are some who seem to just thrive on challenge and in stressful situations. They just really seem to, for whatever reason, some switch flips on for them and they do really, really, really well. But it's important to recognize too that prolonged and threatening stress can sometimes end up being harmful for a person mentally and physically, and we'll talk about that toward the tail end of this video. So there are 4 different kinds of stressors that are out there that you will be expected to know. It's just adding more on to you, I know. But it's important to recognize and differentiate between these because many of you guys experience these. I know you experience these on a daily, weekly, monthly kind of basis. So it's important as we go through this, recognizing how it has real life applications for you, so that way you can kind of recognize what are the things that cause me stress, and do I perceive them as threat or challenge, and how can I adequately cope and address those afterwards. So let's look at catastrophic events. These are sudden, unexpected, fairly life-changing kind of experiences or traumas. So the best example that I can give for this would be my dad's death. It happened literally the day after Christmas. It was December 26th. It was absolutely life-changing for me in terms of so much of how I perceive my daily experiences in life, my interactions with other people, my interactions with my family. And so these were very much, that particular piece was a catastrophic, very sudden and unexpected piece of trauma that has had life-altering implications for me. The second piece to this is the life change or strain. Okay, so these are circumstances that create demands that you have to adjust to. So these aren't necessarily catastrophic kinds of scenarios, and that's important to recognize. A life-changing strain could be something along the lines of having to adjust to the demands of a promotion, for example. Let's say that you get bumped up to being manager at the restaurant that you work at, and that carries with it a certain amount of stress that requires you to work longer hours, be in charge of a whole lot more, have a higher level of responsibility. So that can end up influencing the kind of stressors that you're presented with. Other examples for this, natural disasters, car accidents possibly, losing someone that you love who is somebody who is overseas in the military and who is on active duty. Other life changes that can involve themselves is just adjusting to the demands of relationships. We're going to learn as we move into social psychology about love, all of the different kinds of love that are out there, and just, pro-social relationships between people. But one of the first things that you have to adjust to when you start dating a new person is how much you want to be spending time with that individual, and adjusting that to the demands of your life with your family and your friends, and making sure that you treat everybody equally and you're not spending too terribly much time with your significant other. Weddings, Planning a wedding has been a very interesting, life-changing event, and that has certainly required a great deal for me in terms of my time and how to adjust planning that with being able to do everything that's required of me from work. So there's all different kinds of examples that we can see of these in our everyday lives. Now, chronic stressors are ones that continue over a period of time. This can be things like work or a lack of sleep, any kind of illness that has a tendency to wear you down. That was something that my dad struggled with a great deal, was just a chronic amount of physical stress on his body that ended up causing the heart attack that killed him. Just any kind of level of something that is present in your life for an extended period, trying to find a job and being unemployed and trying to pay bills, all of those different kinds of things. Then there are daily hassles. And this is where I think it becomes most difficult for people to differentiate between the types of stressors, of one being chronic versus a daily hassle. Any kind of irritation or pressure or annoyances that aren't necessarily significant but can add up, those are our daily kind of hassles. And unfortunately for some people, when we start talking about personality types in a second, those with type A personalities, they have a tendency to allow daily hassles to just build up and become chronic stressors as a result. So daily hassles are things like being stuck in traffic, or just having a whole lot of work that you've got to get done by a certain point in that day, or just being stuck in a really long line when you have somewhere that you've got to go. So unfortunately, as I said, sometimes those daily hassles can end up building up and sticking with us over a long period of time because they just tend to bother us so much, and they can end up becoming chronic stressors that can cause pretty harmful effects on us physically. So speaking of physicality here, let's talk about the physical stress response the body undergoes. William Cannon of Cannon and Bard theory of emotion also did some research on stress, and he argued that our stress response, when it is quick, is a fight or flight response that is operating because of our autonomic nervous system and our endocrine system. It's marked by kind of this flooding of epinephrine and norepinephrine in the adrenal glands, to cause us to have that kind of stressed response that many of us are familiar with, that increased heart rate, increased respiration, and then this also ends up causing a mobilization of sugar in the blood and fat, to kind of help us deal with all of that stress, depending on what it is that our body is undergoing. Our body may feel that it needs to hold on to some level of fat, so that way you have the insulation that you need, or the nutrients that you need in order to be able to continue to survive. But the fight or flight response also has a tendency to dull our experience of pain. And this is something we've discussed since pretty much Unit 3, talking about how that adrenal gland can kind of help flood our system of hormones, and work in conjunction with the autonomic nervous system to help us carry out tasks that are pretty extraordinary because we just don't feel pain. In addition to this, you have the brain structures that are involved, and these are very important. I would certainly star these for yourself or write them down on your notes if they're not mentioned there, just so that way you have a better understanding of it. Your hypothalamus and your pituitary gland respond to stress when it is a much more slow kind of stress. So let's differentiate to this, okay? The autonomic nervous system and our adrenal glands with epinephrine and norepinephrine, those kick in that fight or flight response when we have fast onslaught of stress. When it's slower, we're involving the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, because what the pituitary is going to do is it'll trigger outer adrenal glands to secrete what they call glucocorticoids. Say that 3 times fast. It's cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone that's released into our body, and in small amounts, it's a good thing. But the problem is that too much cortisol can end up leading to a lot of problems. You heard me reference the issue of cortisol in Unit 5 when we were looking at altered states of consciousness. If you're not getting enough sleep, the body perceives itself to be in stress, in that fight or flight structure. So it needs to release more cortisol to help you deal with your just everyday daily tasks. And the more cortisol that is released, the greater the damage that it can have to your body. You're just not supposed to have that much of it in your system. Now, as I said, this is just the beginning if the stress is long lasting. If it extends further into things, then you're dealing with the general adaptation syndrome piece, the body's response in that regard, and that is what we're going to discuss now. So GAS, this is how you will hear me reference this a whole lot as we move through the remainder of the unit. General adaptation syndrome was proposed by an Austrian-Canadian named Hans Selye. There are all different kinds of ways that people pronounce his last name. I've heard it Selye, some pronounce it Selye, some Selye. I'm not going to go at you in terms of your pronunciation of it. What I want you to get at the heart at for is what it was that he argued. So general adaptation syndrome says that there are 3 phases of the stress response that our body undergoes physically and psychologically to some extent. The greatest portion to this is going to be the body's physical response, okay? Because a lot of times what has a tendency to happen with stress is the body ends up responding and then you have the cognitive component to it later. So, how does all of this work? In phase 1 of general adaptation syndrome, you have the alarm reaction. So what happens is your hypothalamus sets that fight or flight response into effect. Okay, it will release neurotransmitters and hormones to help you deal with that stressful situation. So the body will respond in kind to increase your heart rate, increase respiration, all of that stuff. Now, this is for quick kinds of scenarios. If the stressor persists over a longer period of time, so you're dealing with chronic stressors, this initial reaction can end up causing some level of distress because it depletes your body's energy and defense resources. Okay, so it basically just wears you out. It can cause stuff like high blood pressure. It can cause your immune system to deteriorate pretty quickly, so you get sick far more easily. And it can cause fatty deposits to end up in your blood vessels, so that way you can have a higher risk for heart attack. And it can cause ulcers and other gastrointestinal issues. So that's very important to recognize that if you move into a scenario of chronic stress in stage 1 and you're just in that high level of alarm reaction for an extended period, it's going to cause a pretty significant detriment. Now, in stage 2, if that stressor continues to persist, but it's not so strong that it ends up overwhelming you during stage 1, then you're going to rebound during this stage 2 period, okay? This is going to have 2 pieces to it. Outwardly, your body is going to end up gaining an advantage and resist the stressor, whatever that might be. But inwardly, what's trying to happen is, we're going back to that issue of homeostasis, it's not going away. Your body is trying to cope with that stress and restore you back to a resting state, one where you are just not all sorts of out of whack. Resistance only applies to the original stressor, and that's very important to remember. Star that for yourself. It's so critical. If another stressor ends up being introduced, your defenses could be so depleted that you're not even going to be able to respond to a second stressor and end up having some level of resistance where your body can kind of try to rebound. So then you get to stage 3. This is the exhaustion stage. If resistance fails to relieve your stress, if your body outwardly is not able to respond and fight things off, and if inwardly homeostasis is not able to be restored, the symptoms of alarm are going to reappear. And so this is going to end up being accompanied by even stronger levels of the autonomic nervous system kicking in. It's going to overcompensate, and the body has already used so much energy that if the stressor is not removed, exhaustion and maybe even possibly death eventually can end up happening. Now, usually there's going to be warning signs that this is occurring, okay? Heart attack, clogged arteries, excessive numbers of colds or flu symptoms or issues with that, frequent headaches, okay? So when you find yourself in a scenario where a stressor is just chronically affecting you, then you're going to get to a point where warning signs are going to provide themselves. So I'm going to give a personal example here just to better help you understand how this might be present in your own life. My job, many teachers will share this understanding with you. Teaching is a very stressful job, even though we have extended periods of time away from school with breaks and summer vacation and all of that. It's not out of the ordinary for me to work 70 or 80 hours a week during the school year in order to make sure that everything is set and good to go. And even then, I still don't get it all situated because you see my brain farts all the time in our Google Calendar and the page numbers that I forget to adjust and all of that stuff. There's just a lot on my mind all the time. And over about the first 5 years of my working career, GAS was kicking in. And so what happened was, I'm going to go back real fast. Stage 1 kicked in with the fight or flight response because I was being, put into the situation of high levels of stress with my job and being exposed to a large number of illnesses that I had never been exposed to before to that level of degree. And so I was starting to have issues with the deterioration of my immune system and stomach gastrointestinal issues. Resistance was not able to operate for me, particularly during last year, because what ended up developing was stage 3 and exhaustion. You've heard me reference some issues that I've had with my stomach, but something that I was diagnosed with last year was a particular situation where I don't have ulcers, but what I constantly create for myself is an overproduction of stomach acid that is wearing away the lining of my stomach. It's a really fancy schmancy term that no matter how many times I've attempted to pronounce it, I really can't. But the basic takeaway that I was presented with after I went and underwent all of these procedures to find out what was going on, because I was experiencing these warning signs of exhaustion. I was just constantly sick. I had high levels of headaches. I was getting more and more migraines, and I was just feeling nauseated all the time. And I went in and I found out that it was because basically this was my body's response to the stress. I was getting very, very close toward exhaustion, and just physiologically speaking, not being able to do my job. And so that required a whole lot of adjustment and coping in kind to what my job presents, so I can continue to do what I love doing, which is teaching and working with you guys. So, in kind of coupling this and joining it together, stress and illness go hand in hand with one another. Any stressor, and that includes mental processes like worrying or fretting or ruminating over something, end up affecting your health and your resources of fighting things off, like your immune system. And because of that, there's just all of these different cycles that end up affecting one another. If stressors are preventing you from sleeping and you get a lack of sleep, then that lack of sleep ends up affecting your immune system as well. And so our human immunoresponse it originally kind of evolved to help us deal with short-term stress, not necessarily chronic, long, extensive levels of it. And so, unfortunately, in some scenarios, the immune system can end up reacting and working by turning on itself in long-term scenarios of stress, because there's no physical enemy for it to battle. There's no, true bacterial or viral infestation in the body. So your response just becomes maladaptive, and it becomes much more vulnerable to injury and infection as a result of just this prolonged exposure to stress. And so it can have a variety of health-related consequences, as you've heard me just share from my own personal experiences, and ones that I don't even doubt that you guys probably end up experiencing. I've always found it quite fascinating after I have my students take the AP exam in May, because that last week after they've finished everything with AP, I have a lot of kids who end up sick. And it's May. It's not a heightened time of illness during the school year. And a lot of that is because they've just kind of hit that exhaustion level. The resistance wasn't able to kick in. And so their body and their immune system is just kind of shot because of all of the stress of trying to properly prepare for that test. So a few things to kind of wrap all of this up. Personality types that have a tendency to lend themselves to particular responses towards stress. You have type A and type B. The type A individual is going to be one that is more often than not pretty competitive and hard driving and very impatient, and they have a tendency to become very, very, very stressed out very easily. Just kind of the slightest thing can have a tendency to just kind of get their haunches on edge and make their sympathetic nervous system kick in. Type B, on the other hand, these individuals are, I mean, they are just very relaxed, laid back, easygoing. They kind of have that mentality of water off a duck's back when presented with stressors. Just kind of let it roll with the punches. Whatever happens, happens. There's no need to stress on it. And they have a tendency to not get nearly as anxious or worked up or stressed when presented with certain experiences with things. So type B personality really does have a tendency to lend itself toward healthier responses when it comes to stress. Now, that being said, type B responses can oftentimes have a tendency to lend themselves toward very unmotivated behavior. They have a tendency to be slightly more lazy and careless and not as conscientious as type A. So, I mean, it's important to recognize that one personality type is not better than the other per se in every level of scenario. So, how do we end up attempting to alleviate stress? What are some strategies to help us cope? The first one is problem-focused coping. This is when we try to alleviate stress directly by altering that stressor or the way we interact with a stressor. So, if you find that your job is causing you stress, you end up finding a new one, or you have a heart-to-heart with your boss, or you maybe take off some of the responsibilities that you were kind of piling on yourself at one point. So this was something that I attempted to do in addressing my GI issues with my stomach. I had been very involved in doing a lot of professional development work for some of the teachers. I was in charge of the mock trial team, and I was working with Model UN. I was a class advisor working with seniors at that point in time, and I just had a very, very large amount of work on my plate, and I had just spread myself very thin. I was in charge of working on tartan time at one point as well, and I went and just said, you know, I need to address what it is that needs to really get done, and I need to kind of take some things off of my plate. And so I kind of peeled back to some extent from some of those responsibilities to make it easier for me to do everything that I needed to do in the classroom. And that definitely has improved some things that I've dealt with pretty significantly. A second way of looking at it in terms of alleviating your stress is the emotion-focused coping method, which is basically just if you don't feel like there's anything that you can do to change the stressful situation, the thing that's causing you to be stressed out, then what you can attempt to do is just alleviate that stress by addressing your emotional needs. So this is certainly a different means of addressing the problem, because in problem focus you are going directly to change the stressor itself and get yourself out of that situation. So if, for example, you're frustrated with your job and it's causing you a lot of stress, what you do is you vent to a friend about the pressures that you're feeling, or you attempt to distract yourself in some way by trying to get your mind off of the situation. So you go out with friends, or you do some kind of activity that you enjoy doing, like going for a walk or talking to friends or something along those lines. So these are two means of attempting to address and cope with stress. It's just their routes to addressing them are different. But you don't have to just stick with those two. There are cognitive routes to it. You can attempt to change your thought patterns in general. As was said earlier, if you perceive a stressor to be a challenge rather than a threat, then you are more likely to better respond to it and to not feel as stressed out. So for those of you guys that are perceiving psychology to be a stressor that feels more threatening than challenging, maybe what we need to do is have you come in and we can sit down and we can talk and figure out how it can go to be a challenge rather than a threat for you. There's also the emotional piece to it, knowing that you have a support system. It's very, very important for those who feel really stressed out and overwhelmed that they have some people there to help them out when they are presented with a stressor and it is, inflicting certain amount of some level of effect on them. It's also really, really helpful for people to have those around them just because you can bounce ideas off of people. They can give you advice on how to help you, especially if they've been in scenarios that are similar. So that's definitely something to keep in mind for yourself if you find that you are overwhelmed by stress in your daily life. Behaviorally speaking, you can change your behavior to minimize the impact of the stress. So, time management, getting rid of some activities. This was something that I attempted to do, as I just shared with you guys on the previous slide. Time management, and that's something that so many of you guys have told me that you struggle with, is just feeling so weighed down by the amount of work that's expected of you and to have it done in a very small period of time. And usually my response to that is life is about managing time. You are always going to have something that is going to make it very difficult for you to evenly balance things in your life, whether it be work and personal life, work and family, work and having children, work and getting married, or for you guys at this point in time in your life, managing school and work and personal life. Sometimes just addressing that aspect of the behavior of the time management piece can really, really, really go a long way in enabling kids to finally feel as if the class is manageable and something that they can handle and be successful in. Physically speaking, you can also change your level of arousal to the responses, or to the stressors that evoke the responses from you, whether that be medications that are anti-anxiety meds, for example, relaxation techniques like meditation, or exercise. Both of those have been used to show some level of positive effect on the experience that people have of stress. And where relaxation is concerned, what you're going to need to be able to achieve that is kind of a quiet, calm environment with as few distractions as possible, so that way, especially if the issue is time management, you can deal with that accordingly and not have too many distractions that are pulling you in so many directions and making it feel as if you have a smaller amount of time than you actually do. You need some kind of mental device that keeps you focused and kind of prevents you from just kind of allowing your mind to wander. And that's something that's very difficult for kids to adjust to now, especially because you are just so plugged in. If you think back to the simulation that we did with our cell phones when we went without them, so many of you guys found yourselves recognizing that it was kind of a crutch for you when your mind would wander and you found yourself kind of bored and unengaged. And for a lot of kids, teenagers especially, when their mind starts to wander when they're doing homework or something along those lines, what ends up happening is just pull out my phone and I can tweet some people and I can, see what's going on with Instagram and what people have uploaded there. And I can, look at all of these and text all these people and send Snapchats. And unfortunately, that ends up blowing a lot of the time that you have available to you to address that time management stressor. You need a let it happen attitude. And this is something that I will personally acknowledge that I'm still struggling with. It's just not in my personality to just let things happen. I'm one of those, I border more along the lines of type A than I do type B. I very much get my panties in a bunch, so to speak, when things that are supposed to be planned out don't necessarily go that way. And I do allow that to affect me far more than I should. But in order to ensure a relaxed kind of approach to stress, you need to have things are going to happen. There are certain things that I can control, certain things that I can't, and I need to recognize the difference. And that can go a long way in helping you to have a less stressful reaction to things that overwhelm you. Final piece is a comfortable position to prevent muscular tension. This is something that a lot of people don't necessarily keep in mind for themselves when they're attempting to relax and de-stress. If you're sitting in a chair and attempting to do some level of your psychology work, and even while you're sitting here, watching these video notes and you're kind of hunched over in your chair, that creates a level of muscle tension because your muscles are flexed and they're held tightly in that position for a really long period. And so that can lend itself toward, an unpleasant physiological reaction towards stress, and it can create a lot of muscle tension that can lend itself toward just making you feel all around unpleasant and just not feel very well. And so physiologically speaking, that can end up helping quite a bit. So this is the tail end of our video notes on stress and how we experience it and cope with it. I told you this was going to be a longer one. We are definitely going to do some activities in class with one another to make sure that this is a little easier to understand, because I know GAS in particular can be a little difficult for kids to latch on to. So if you have any questions, just let me know.